Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. We are here today to do a deep dive on The Color Purple by Alice Walker, a book that was originally published in 1982 and which won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1983. Lots of interesting stuff to talk about here. I will have timestamps in the description box down below so you can jump to different parts of the conversation. First, we're going to talk about the book, and then we'll get into some of the controversy that is attached mostly to Alice Walker, not necessarily to the book. So if you'd like to navigate around, there will be timestamps down below. There will also be links to my other Pulitzer videos and posts on the website. I will have a link to my post on my website about The Color Purple. It will have links to all of my sources and things like that. But let's get into this. The Color Purple is an American literary masterpiece. It won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, as I said. It has been adapted for film twice because the second film adaptation has just been released in theaters as I am filming this. It has also been adapted into a Broadway musical, and the second movie, the one that is coming out as I am filming this, is an adaptation of the stage musical. All of that just to say that The Color Purple is something of a cultural institution in the United States, a book that has earned literary respect and popular appeal, and which has had a pretty remarkable staying power in popular culture. It's on a similar level as To Kill a Mockingbird and, well, Gone with the Wind, a book I'm really not a fan of. I don't think The Color Purple rides as high as To Kill a Mockingbird or Gone with the Wind, but it is sort of on that same level where at this point the appeal is sort of self-perpetuating and new generations keep discovering the project, partially because the book is so well beloved, but also partially because there are successful adaptations out there, and that helps keep drawing people into the property being The Color Purple in this case. I read The Color Purple for the first time roughly 20 years ago. This is the edition of the book that I originally purchased and read, and the edition that I reread in order to be able to do this video. I just tracked down a hardcover copy for my Pulitzer shelf. So this is the edition that I'm holding up. It is not a first edition. First editions can be very expensive, but it is from early in the print run. So this is what The Color Purple looked like when it was originally published in 1982. I have also frequently cited The Color Purple as one of my favorite books. Indeed, when I recently ranked the Pulitzer books that I have read so far, The Color Purple was close to the top. That will be one of the videos that is linked down below. But in recent years, Alice Walker has revealed that she has some controversial opinions. I would go so far as to describe them as hateful opinions that have been fueled by online conspiracy theories. And the question that we're going to get into in the second part of the video is whether or not that should impact how we see her work, and if it should impact how we see The Color Purple. So we're going to talk about The Color Purple, its legacy, and what happens when a complicated author produces a book that we love. Just so you know, there will be spoilers once we get into discussing the actual book. The first thing I like to do in these deep dives is take a look back at the year we are talking. So this is fun for me because 1982 happens to be the year in which I was born. And again, just for clarity's sake, The Color Purple won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1983, but because the Pulitzer is awarded the year after the eligibility period, it was published in 1982. That's why we're looking at what was happening in the world in 1982. In bookstores, we get a perfect encapsulation of my childhood because according to Publishers Weekly, the best-selling book of 1982 was the novelization of the film E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And the reason that's a perfect encapsulation of my childhood is that I was not actually a fan of E.T., but because it was such a pervasively popular movie in my childhood, people just assumed that I would like it. So I was frequently gifted things with E.T. merchandise and all kinds of things like that, and I didn't want them. It was just annoying. I was also not a fan of Pee Wee Herman, but people just assumed that any boy my age was. So, those are the two big properties in my childhood that I didn't really want anything to do with, but people just kind of assumed, you must like them, you're a kid. And anyway, the Nobel Prize for Literature went to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, quote, for his novels and short stories in which the fantastic and the realistic are combined in a richly composed world of imagination reflecting a continent's life and conflicts, end quote. The National Book Award was in a brief phase where they awarded 2 prizes for fiction, one for hardcover and one for paperback. They were also briefly aligned with the same calendar as the Pulitzer Prize, so they were awarded the year after the eligibility period, which is why the hardcover prize went to Rabbit is Rich in 1982 by John Updike, and that book won the Pulitzer Prize the same year in 1982. The paperback prize went to William Maxwell for So Long, See You Tomorrow, and then The Color Purple went on to win the hardcover prize for the National Book Award the following year, which is also when it won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. In the movies, since it was already the best-selling book of 1982, you can probably guess that E.T. the Extraterrestrial was also the highest-grossing movie of the year by a wide margin. Raiders of the Lost Ark came in second. Chariots of Fire won Best Picture at the Academy Awards, but the 1982 film release that went on to win the following year was Gandhi. In music, Michael Jackson took the world by storm, releasing Thriller in November. It went on to be the best-selling album of the following 2 years. And I'm telling you, the year I was born is packed with memorable pop culture. And in the news, speaking of pop culture, in March, Klaus von Bülow was found guilty of attempting to murder his wife. Jeremy Irons won an Oscar for playing Klaus von Bülow a few years later in the movie Reversal of Fortune. The 10-week-long Falklands War began in April between Argentina and the United Kingdom. Argentine forces surrendered on the day I was born in June. And finally, in September, the Tylenol murders took place where 7 people were killed by Tylenol that was laced with potassium cyanide, a case that has never been solved, but is the reason every medication is tamper-resistant these days. I mean, think back, things weren't tamper-resistant before 1982. And that case is exactly why. So moving back to The Color Purple, let's first talk about what this book is about. To answer that question in thematic terms, The Color Purple is about sisterhood, both literal and spiritual. It's about women coming together and forming a community in the face of a world that wants to treat them as second-class citizens. It's also about actualizing and believing in yourself to take control of your own destiny. It's about not letting the traumas in your past define who you are in the present or in the future. It's about fighting for yourself when others want you to be silent or control you. And it's about the cruel legacies of the slave trade, both here in the United States and also in Africa. As an aside, the book Homegoing by Yajasi, which is terrific, would be a fantastic companion read to The Color Purple if you haven't read it already. And lastly, The Color Purple is a profoundly lesbian book about accepting who you are, even if who you are stands against what normal society would be willing to accept. There are 3 oppressive systems at play in The Color Purple. First, there is colonialism, aka the often genocidal overtaking of the world by white people who subjugate people they deem inferior. Second, there is the world of men who enforce and perpetuate a patriarchal system that denies women of their rights, their joy, and their ability to express themselves. Third, there is the more complex oppression of religion. I say it's more complex because this is a book that believes religion and spirituality are good in and of themselves, but it frequently paints organized religious systems as corrupt tools of oppression. The characters who find peace in this book often determine that they can enjoy their religious beliefs on their own terms, and that going to church often pushes you further away from a relationship with God. Practically, this is an epistolary novel following the life of Celie. For the first half of the book, Celie is writing letters to God. In short bursts, she relates the unhappy story of her life so far. She has been abused and called ugly by the man she knows as her father, who has nevertheless raped her and fathered 2 children that he subsequently sent away from her. We later learn that he is not, in fact, her father, but the trauma of incest and assault and abuse still lingers and follows her for her whole life. She was married off to a man Celie only refers to as Mr. for most of the book. She does actually start using his first name in a passing moment at the very end of the book that signifies both his and her growth as people throughout the whole narrative of the story. Mr. was actually interested in Seeley's sister, Nettie, but settled for Seeley because it was promised to him by the person that Seeley thought was her father that Seeley would take care of his children. That adds to Seeley's belief that she is ugly and unwanted, and that the only person who loves her is her sister, Nettie. And even that is taken from her because after Nettie briefly comes to live with Seeley, Mr. sends Nettie away. The trauma of this separation is also something that Seeley carries with her for a large part of the book. And in the second half of the book, she actually begins writing letters to Nettie instead of God. For a while, Seeley remains an insecure, desperately unhappy woman who quietly goes about the business of living without actually living. Things begin to change when Shug Avery, a woman Mr. has been infatuated with for years, comes to stay with them. This forms a romantic triangle. Seeley and Mr. are both in love with Shug, and Shug engages in romantic relationships with both of them separately. Eventually, Seeley and Shug discover that Mr. has been hiding letters from Nettie. In the second half of the book, we catch up to Nettie's story. This is where Seeley starts redirecting her letters from God to Nettie. But we also get to read the letters that Nettie has sent and catch up to where she has been and what she has been doing in the ensuing decades since she was sent away from Seeley. We learn that she has been living with missionaries who adopted Seeley's children, and eventually she ends up in Africa with them, sort of acting as an aunt to children that she actually literally is an aunt to. Seeley's relationship with Shug and the promise of a reunion with Nettie inspires Seeley to take charge of her own destiny. She grows in confidence. She leaves Mr. to make her own path in life. She starts a business sewing pants for women, which is a scandalous idea at the time. And she learns to stand on her own 2 feet. Her relationship with Shug ends on a somewhat ambiguous note. Shug returns to her after another relationship with a man ends, but you don't really know if it will last or what the relationship with Seeley is going to look like as they move forward into the future. But at the end of the day, Seeley has found her own strength, so you know she will be okay regardless. She even forms a respectful friendship with Mr., who learns to see her as a human after she leaves him. But best of all, Seeley and Nettie finally reunite, and Nettie brings Seeley's now grown children back to her. As a point of interest before we move into the next section, the character of Seeley was based on Alice Walker's grandmother. I just thought that was really interesting. You might be wondering, what does the title The Color Purple mean? Well, during a conversation about religion, Shug Avery tells Seeley about how she believes God works and how she has a relationship with God on her own terms outside of the church. During this conversation, Shug notes that she believes, quote, "It pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it," end quote. The implication is that we need to look for and appreciate the beauty in the everyday world. It's so easy not to notice the good things or take them for granted. It's kind of like telling someone to stop and smell the roses. Of course, the color purple itself has symbolic meaning about systemic abuses and the things that people have to overcome and all of that. And there's a lot more to think about here thematically, especially since this conversation between Shug and Seeley is a key moment in Seeley's process of self-actualization. But I think that is the broad strokes, quick explanation of what the title, The Color Purple, means. Next, let's talk about why this won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The original intention of the Pulitzer was, at least implicitly, to help legitimize American art by recognizing important American novels in real time. This is an example of a time when that worked. The Color Purple has weighty things to say about heavy topics, but it's also an enjoyable story with solid, memorable characters. If you need proof, just look at how many times it has been adapted for stage and screen, and how it has remained in the conversation about great American literature ever since it was published. This is that rare book that is continually respected by both critics and audiences. The Color Purple won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction because it was recognized as the American masterpiece that it was. Now, is The Color Purple any good? In a serious bit of shade, the New York Times had this to say about The Color Purple in its article about the best books of 1982. They don't usually comment on books that don't make the list, at least not now, but in 1982, they were apparently very willing to throw shade. Here's the quote. Everyone who read Alice Walker's The Color Purple, which did not make the list, agreed that its first 75 pages contained probably the best fiction written this year, but that the quality was not sustained. Ouch. I also think that's deeply unfair, but it was interesting to see. And as I was rereading The Color Purple, I started tracking the changes that happened after the first 75 pages to see what the New York Times Book Review believed took away from the quality of the book. After the first 75 pages, Seeley begins her lesbian affair with Shug. That's probably a big part of it. 1982, classically not a year that was great on queer rights or anything like that. But also, not long after that, Seeley finds the letters from Nettie, which begins the portion of the novel that heavily deals with the continuing colonial problems in Africa. In my deep dive on Andrew Sean Greer's Less, which will be one of the videos linked down below, I referred to it as the first Pulitzer Prize winning novel that significantly centers on an LGBTQ plus storyline and character. Some people pushed back and asked about The Hours by Michael Cunningham, which in my memory is only partly a queer story, but a reread will determine if that is a fair designation or not. But oddly, no one mentioned The Color Purple, and I didn't really remember just how profoundly lesbian The Color Purple is as a novel. The most surprising thing about this reread is that it's how profoundly lesbian this is as a novel. And for anything that was published in 1982 that also achieved mainstream success, that is wildly groundbreaking. And yet it's also interesting that it's not a part of the book most people remember or focus on when they talk about the book. This is an incredibly queer representation of life, and I just hadn't remembered how hard it went in that direction. Still, despite clearly having detractors at the New York Times, it is clear that The Color Purple has deservedly been recognized by many as an American classic. It's a great book, and it is one that has held up pretty well over time. I will say, however, that Nettie's letters from Africa bear a very heavy thematic burden that causes some drag on the pace of the book. So it's not entirely unfair if that was the aspect of the book that the New York Times Book Review was complaining about, but I think they went a little too far. Those chapters where Nettie has the letters from Africa, they do tend to be longer than the rest of the chapters, which are usually only about 2 to 3 pages. I only mention that because I think one of the things that makes The Color Purple so easy to read, despite a lot of heavy trigger warnings, is that the short bursts of the chapters really go a long way toward making the content of the book digestible. Nettie's letters feel more like info dumps than a smooth progression of the narrative. It almost feels like ideas for a separate book that don't quite belong here, but ultimately I think it works. Still, if I were to identify a weak point in the novel, it would be that. But overall, yes, this is not just a good novel, it is a great novel. Now, let's talk about Alice Walker. Who is she? Alice Malsenior Tallulah Kate Walker was born in Eatonton, Georgia on February 9th, 1944. Her parents were both sharecroppers. She was enrolled in school at just 4 years old, and due to segregation, was only able to attend schools that were designated for Black students. After graduating as valedictorian, Walker was given a full scholarship at Spelman College, but transferred to Sarah Lawrence, where she ultimately graduated. Her love for reading and writing is the result of an unfortunate accident. At 8 years old, Walker's brother shot her in the eye with a BB gun, and since her family did not own a car, they could not immediately get her medical attention. As a result, Walker is permanently blind in her right eye. Following this incident, she discovered reading and writing. Walker has also been a devout activist her whole life. She was part of the civil rights movement. She met Martin Luther King Jr., and she participated in the 1963 March on Washington. She also established a brand of feminism known as womanism, which essentially is an early attempt at intersectional feminism. It focused on women of color. She has also been very active in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, often referring to Israel as an apartheid state and encouraging performers to boycott performances in Israel. She also famously told the 1985 film adaptation of The Color Purple not to screen in Israel or South Africa. Some of Walker's activism has earned her a reputation as a controversial figure. We'll discuss that in a moment. I will also say that Walker is one of only a handful of authors to win a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award for the same book. People tend to assume that that is something that happens a lot. It is actually far more rare than people think it is. Which takes us to the thorny part of this conversation. Is The Color Purple problematic? The answer is no. But Alice Walker is. Controversy began with her activism and continued with The Color Purple, which has been frequently banned or challenged since it was published. You can probably guess that there has been pushback to the depiction of sexuality in this book, but that is not all. There have also been complaints about the negative portrayal of Black men in The Color Purple, and also about the portrayal of Black women in The Color Purple. There's a lot to talk about with Alice Walker's activism, good, bad, and in between. I'm going to skip over a lot of that to focus on the big thing, which is the fact that Alice Walker has elevated anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The New York Times notes, quote, "She has praised David Icke, who has written that Holocaust denial should be taught in schools and that the Talmud is a racist document. He is also known for a conspiracy theory that a group of child-sacrificing lizard people, many of whom are Jewish, are running the world." End quote. And if you haven't heard that lizard people thing before, believe me, it is more pervasive than you might think. My foster son actually believed that conspiracy theory when he came to live with us, and that was, educating about conspiracy theories was something we had to work with him about. In a separate article in the New York Times, Walker had this to say about Icke's work, quote, "In Icke's books, there is the whole of existence on this planet and several others to think about. A curious person's dream come true." End quote. Some people will say that appreciation of work by a problematic figure like David Icke is not necessarily an indication that a particular person is problematic. But when you continually uphold the work of someone who has done a lot of anti-Semitic work and pushed forth a lot of conspiracy theories, eventually it becomes part of your brand, because continuing to hold that person up is something that you are doing. Critics also point to Study the Talmud, a poem Walker wrote that has been criticized for anti-Semitic sentiment. Questioned about the accusations of anti-Semitism, Walker claims that her criticism is not against Jewish people, but against Israel. Essentially, she says that what people see as anti-Semitism from her is really just an extension of her activism on the topic of Israel and Palestine. People close to Alice Walker tend to remain mum on the topic, although Walker's ex-husband has said that he never saw evidence of anti-Semitic beliefs during the time that they were married. But others who do know her have said that her continued public support of Icke and her own poem To Study the Talmud is dangerous and harmful. I tend to agree. It's just not good if numerous people have pointed out to you that you are holding up a set of ideas that have been harmful to a group of people, and your response is to deny that and continue to support that person and their ideas. There's an unwillingness from Walker to learn and grow on this topic, and that's not really a good thing. What I think this represents is how activism can be warped by misinformation into something that is toxic in the internet era. Walker had a genuine political interest in Israel and Palestine, and current events have shown that there was cause for concern there. But as Walker got older and the internet rose to prominence, it appears that Walker's activism took a turn toward the toxic, and she just is not willing to interrogate that or learn in any way, because she, again, has held up some things that have been very damaging and bad, and she won't stop doing it. Instead, she just kind of digs in and entrenches herself further. The same is true of Walker's recent public defense of J.K. Rowling. When I first heard about this, I guess I wanted to believe that Walker's statements were being taken out of context, or that she was sort of misguidedly defending J.K. Rowling without understanding what J.K. Rowling is saying or how harmful J.K. Rowling's attitude toward trans people is. Unfortunately, I looked up the statement that Alice Walker wrote on her website. It will be linked in my website post down below. And actually, this content of the statement is worse than what had been reported. Walker and J.K. Rowling appear to have united in a belief that accepting a trans person's rights is a dangerous step toward erasing all of womanhood. They have taken something good, feminism, and somehow warped it into a panic that inhibits the rights of another group. Walker has done something particularly damaging in this regard because she is attempting to weaponize her status as a wise elder. She actually refers to herself as a wise elder in that website post of hers in order to give herself the appearance of being reasonable and of knowing better than other people. She is also attempting to position a belief that trans rights erase women's rights as a reasonable point of view. And at the end of the day, it is not. Trans women are women, they have rights, and women are women, and they have rights. Both of those things can be true. Accepting the rights and the human dignity of a trans person isn't taking anything away from a woman. We don't need to get into that whole thing here. I will also say this, though. It's interesting, given the stance Alice Walker has recently taken against transgender rights, that part of the patriarchal critique of The Color Purple also explores the oppressive nature of gender expectations. It is frequently commented on that strong women in The Color Purple are behaving as men, but men are portrayed in a similar trap. For instance, Harpo likes to do cooking and cleaning, but those are not things that a man is supposed to enjoy, so he tends to leave them alone and push them onto his wife, Sophia. And as soon as Harpo marries Sophia, he begins to see her strength and outspoken nature as problems of obedience that he needs to physically fight against. The end result is that neither Harpo nor Sophia are satisfied. This means that at some point in the past, Walker understood that gender expectations were a trap that left countless people feeling unfulfilled. But today, she uses those expectations as a weapon. And the other big question about The Color Purple is, should Alice Walker or The Color Purple be canceled? The short answer is this: not in my opinion, but let's get into the complexities. First of all, the term canceled has gotten far too politicized and way overblown. I'm using it here because it's just easier. People sort of understand the term, even if its connotations have gotten warped into something well beyond what it actually is. For my purposes, cancellation just means, should I continue to support this author with my money? Kind of like deciding whether or not to boycott something. The author, Alice Walker, is allowed to exist and continue making money off of their work. You just get to decide whether or not you want to opt into helping them make a paycheck. Conservatives will balk and say something about First Amendment rights, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about deciding whether or not to financially support an artist. You get to make that decision. And the only way to properly do that is to be informed about what the person has done, and you get to decide if you think it is harmful enough that you should withdraw your support of it. That's all. Many people are not even aware of Walker's controversial beliefs, or they dismiss them as if they aren't very serious. But recently, some people have begun questioning why Alice Walker seems to get a free pass on a lot of these things, especially when J.K. Rowling has become a lightning rod of controversy, and Alice Walker is somehow over here agreeing with J.K. Rowling and not really being held accountable for that. And the reality is, I don't think we're ever going to get a satisfying resolution on this topic. First, because we live in highly politicized times, and second, because life and the universe are, frankly, too messy to offer tidy endings to really anything. It also feels like our human instinct for things to neatly be categorized as good or bad means that the knee-jerk reaction is to assume that we're either going to outright cancel The Color Purple and or Alice Walker, or we're going to forgive her completely. Those are not the only two options. One of the most immediate responses to the question of canceling a public figure is that an audience should separate the artist from their art. The idea is that we can appreciate the artist's output without needing to consider the artist, what they believe, what they support, and who they harm. Most of the time, this is an argument that strikes me as incredibly naive, because when you're talking about, say, Woody Allen, the artist frequently is the art. Woody Allen has written vaguely fictionalized versions of himself in many of his movies. Many of his characters have uncomfortable relationships with women who are supposed to be off limits. The artist is inextricable from the art. The same is true when someone like Peter Henke wins a Nobel Prize for literature. It feels silly for someone to say you should separate the harmful ideas that Henke has espoused from his art, particularly when many of his writings reflect those exact ideas. The political has a way of bleeding into the personal, no matter how much we would prefer to believe that we can separate them. However, having said all of that, I do actually think that Alice Walker and The Color Purple are one of the rare instances where it is actually possible to achieve this separation. You can read The Color Purple and appreciate it and not dive into any of the problematic things about Alice Walker herself. Now, yes, there are political ideas in The Color Purple that reflect Walker's beliefs and opinions, but The Color Purple has nothing to say about Judaism or transgender rights. Most people in 1982 wouldn't even have understood the term transgender. This is a novel that skirts the negative parts of Walker, or perhaps one that was published long before some of those beliefs turned into something toxic. The Color Purple is not a book that is in need of re-examination in the way that Gone with the Wind absolutely needs to be re-examined, because there are problematic things about Gone with the Wind that most people were, and when I say most people, I mean white people, were able to overlook in order to enjoy the book. But there is something very insidious in that book that needs to be reckoned with, and for that reason, Gone with the Wind needs to be re-examined. The Color Purple, not so much. It's also not a case like To Kill a Mockingbird, where some current discourse has attempted to, unfairly in my opinion, brand a book as problematic when it actually is not. The Color Purple is great. It's Alice Walker who needs to be looked at in a more complicated light. And it is clear at this point that Walker is incredibly resistant to evolving on issues where she has been problematic in recent years. And while I do think we should continue to interrogate her for her positions and why she holds them, and while I do think she should continue to be held accountable for positions that are harmful to other people, I think we mostly benefit from using Alice Walker as a cautionary tale. Instead of canceling Alice Walker, we can discuss her evolution from activist to spreader of harmful misinformation and hopefully understand how to avoid those pitfalls ourselves. In an age where misinformation is all too easy to access, I hope we can learn from Alice Walker how to avoid falling prey to conspiracy theories. And I hope we can learn that when confronted about topics we've gotten wrong, we can learn from the experience instead of digging in and entrenching ourselves further. Personally, I don't feel comfortable giving Alice Walker any of my money, but I purchased my copy of The Color Purple 20 years ago, and when I tracked down my hardcover of it, I got it from a seller on eBay, so the proceeds from this book don't go back to Alice Walker or the publisher. I'm also probably not going to read any of her other books, but I'm not going to remove The Color Purple from my shelf. I'm not going to try to pretend that it doesn't exist. I think it's a good book that people could benefit from reading, but every time the book does come up, I will point out the larger context around Alice Walker so other people can make up their own minds and be informed about what they would like to do. The only note I will leave you on in this topic is that perhaps you don't see what the big deal is about the things Alice Walker has said or the ideas she has promoted or the harm that she has done. Maybe you aren't Jewish or transgender. I would just say, consider how Alice Walker's toxic activism would feel if it was directed at you. And if you still feel comfortable supporting her with your money, fine. But please consider how it would feel to be the target of those harmful pieces of misinformation, or if she said that she didn't really believe that you had rights. And maybe you will think differently in the end. The next question I have is, are there adaptations or sequels? Indeed, there are. The Color Purple was first adapted for film in 1985, with Steven Spielberg controversially directing because he was a Jewish white man, and Whoopi Goldberg and Oprah Winfrey earning Oscar nominations for their roles as Celie and Sophia, respectively. Oprah helped finance the 2005 musical adaptation of The Color Purple for Broadway, and the musical was brought back again in 2015 in a staging that was even more celebrated than the original run. That is what led to the film adaptation of the musical, which is hitting theaters Christmas 2023 as I am filming this video. Next, we have the question, is The Color Purple the great American novel? If you follow along, you know. I don't believe any one book can encapsulate this complicated country's experience. The best you can do is come up with a short list of books that head in that direction. And yes, The Color Purple should be included in that list. Let's get to another interesting question, which is, what was The Color Purple's competition for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction? And this is an interesting question because the other finalists for the Pulitzer Prize that year were Ann Tyler's Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant and Chaim Grade's Rabbis and Wives. This is an interesting mix, especially when you look at the inclusion of Chaim Grade, who had passed away when Rabbis and Wives was nominated for the Pulitzer. His work has since faded into near total obscurity, especially when compared with the other two finalists. It is not easy to track down copies of his books, which have been out of print for a long time. Used copies tend to be expensive, although you can find copies that are not in good condition that are more affordable. The sentiment on Rabbis and Wives seems mixed, even if you look at reviews from 1982. It feels like the intention of the Pulitzer jury was to attempt to shine a light on a lesser-known writer who had passed away, in an attempt to help secure some sort of legacy for his work. Unfortunately, it didn't really take, except for the fact that we are talking about him now. It feels like the nomination is less about the individual work and more about recognizing the career of an author who had passed away, unfortunately. Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant is a different story. Ann Tyler earned 3 nominations for the Pulitzer in the 1980s. Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant was the first. She was subsequently nominated for The Accidental Tourist and won on her third try, which was Breathing Lessons. Her books are still very much in print and celebrated, including Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant, although not on the scale of The Color Purple. I read Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant to prepare for this post, and I have to say, it is an incredible novel. It might be an all-time favorite of mine as well. Other notable books from 1982 were Gloria Naylor's The Women of Brewster Place and A Boy's Own Story, Edmund White's queer classic. It's interesting that at a time when queer stories were so frequently overlooked or erased, 3 books that unapologetically featured queer stories or characters were put out into the world, and all of them have become classics to some degree or in their own right. You also had Ann Beatty's story collection, The Burning House, which was another celebrated book published in 1982. Let's get to the big question. Should The Color Purple have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction? It's interesting that 1982 had so many books to offer for consideration. And I have to say, Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant will be one of my favorite reads from this year. It may, again, even be an all-time favorite of mine. I have to wait to see how I feel when recency bias is not so much of a problem. And I think it's safe to say that The Color Purple was much easier to recognize than other now classics that discuss either the Black experience in this country, like Women of Brewster Place, or queer stories like A Boy's Own Story. Still, even though I love Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant, I think this is a case where the Pulitzer Board got it correct when it selected The Color Purple. And if you don't believe me, just look at the surprisingly popular appeal of a novel about Black life, sexual assault, racism, incest, abuse, sexuality, gender expectations, and more. It's a classic. It deserves to be a classic. But we do need to talk about Alice Walker and some of the things that she has said and done and how harmful they can be. For the record, though, if I were judging for 1982, my finalists would be The Color Purple, Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant, and The Women of Brewster Place, and my winner would still be The Color Purple. So there you have it. That is everything on The Color Purple and Alice Walker. If you have thoughts about anything that I have discussed in this video, I would love to hear them in the comment section down below. Again, refer to the description box for more links to other Pulitzer videos that I have done and conversations that I have had. I don't know what my next Pulitzer book will be. I have a couple of options that I'm thinking about for 2024, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about The Color Purple and Alice Walker in the comment section down below. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.